Welcome, everyone, to Zigging When Others Zag, Making Your Brand Stand Out. My name is Avelyn Austin. I'm EVP of Strategy and Development here at REQ. And I'm thrilled to be here with my colleagues, Stephen Kostant and Kenny Rufino. As we jump in today, I will start sharing a presentation and as well as an agenda. But I want to give a shout out to the two folks that will be presenting today and give you a little background of their experience within brand and why they really are the experts at REQ that bring our clients along, whether you are a B2B, a business to government brand, technology, or a consumer brand. These folks have worked with it all. So I'm thrilled to introduce Stephen Kostant, our Senior Brand Strategist at REQ. We have worked together for nearly 10 years, same with Kenny. And between the both of them, they each have spent over 20 years in the brand and creative space. So we're really thrilled to have them here. Stephen is a Senior Brand Strategist. Before REQ, he has worked with brands at R2I, as well as Fleishman-Hillard, the folks like National Geographic, AT&T. He really comes with a background of for-profit, nonprofit, as well as the public sector as well. We also have Kenny Rufino, our EVP and Creative Director here at REQ, really working across a team of very talented designers and copywriters. He comes to us with a background from Random House, where he was a creative director working directly with the authors and publications, as well as a decade at Media Bistro. So thank you both for joining us, and again to all of our attendees. Today we're going to go through presentation mode, and then we would love to have people add their questions or comments directly into the chat. Elizabeth Ashley, our colleague, is going to be monitoring that chat, and at the end when we get into discussion, we're going to lower the slides and we'll invite anyone to come off mute and ask your questions to our panelists. So with that, I'll go ahead and screen share here. Wonderful. So today we're going to go through three major areas. First, brand definition. What is a brand? What makes up a brand? And then we'll talk about brand differentiation. So that's really the area that we'll get into: zigging when others zag, how to differentiate among crowded marketplaces, or as you're maybe an emerging marketplace. And then Kenny is going to jump into brand identity. We often think about it as a logo, but there's so much more to a brand identity. And having Kenny speak to all of those elements and how they all work together, I anticipate we'll give a lot of discussion at the end. So as we jump in, I'm going to pass it directly over to you, Stephen.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Avelyn, and thank you all for joining and sharing together your lunch or your coffee. I hope in the next hour it'll be informative. It'll be quick-paced in some ways because there's a lot to cover. And I'm really excited to do this with Kenny. I mean, we've been partners in brand for many, many years, both large and small. And I think that by bringing the two of us together from creative and strategy, you'll get a sense of the holistic sense of what a brand is and what a brand strategy is. So that being said, let's get into it. Let's go to the next slide. Many of you probably know a lot, and I think the purpose of this presentation is not only to give you new insights, but also perhaps to reassure you of the things that you already know. And I think that brands are misunderstood in many ways, yet they have an incredible value, and they're so much part of our lives. But just some very top-line clarity, sort of measured points of what a brand is and what it's not. It's more than a logo. I mean, it has an identity in the physical world, but it's that emotional connection and a promise. It's that reason to believe. It makes us feel belonging, and we think about belonging as something that is really critical, not only to our families and to our loved ones, but to things that we buy, to things that we transact. And it's that bridge between what is and what could be. And in some ways, we'll see how that sense of belonging really defines a brand. If you go to the next, it has two worlds. And I think that as we do the look at through this presentation, Kenny's going to spend a lot of time in the physical. If you look at and think about, Nike, in your mind, it's that swoosh, and it has a physicality, it has a logo, an identity, a type, a slogan, etc., has a color palette. And that brands live in the mind, and that's where the emotional side is, which was what I'll talk about in the first part of the presentation, is what is that mind share? When you think about a brand, what does it mean to you in terms of its story, in terms of its experience, in terms of its tone, its attitude? What is it that makes you love something when you think about your own choices of I was talking to Kenny before about buying a new television. What is it that makes him want to buy a certain type of television because of something that may convey its functionality, but also its story, its sort of sense of grit? If you think about something like Levi's, in other words, that authenticity, what is that an emotional connection? And that's really important. Why? Because human beings, as we buy things, as we transact, we do that with heart and mind. In other words, we are emotional beings, and therefore one should not discredit the value of that emotion. So let's move on. So it impacts the emotion. I mean, in so many ways, that is so critical, that idea that we love something as well as we want something, as well as understanding the functionality. But emotions are critical to brands. Next. It has to feel authentic. I mean, in some ways, more than ever, with our ability through social media and more, and our connections that we all have, something that is not real, something that is fake, is really very much at jeopardy. And though you think about something real, what is that brand that really conveys something real? Well, is it Patagonia, or is it the story? That's fine. Let's move on. Is it that story? What is that story? And the value of a story is incredibly critical. Now, we think about stories, and if you meet someone and you so happens in the course of a conversation find out that you're from the same town, and therefore you may have same friends in common, or something about that neighborhood, that story brings you together. Likewise, it's the same relationship between a brand, and that brand could be a business, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a government agency. I mean, if you think about story and you think about NASA as government, it's about that exploration. If you think about a nonprofit, you might think about Charity Water, which is an incredible brand that was a story of a founder who was a sort of trend center in New York, who went to Africa and realized that water is really not clean, and it really responds to a way in which disease takes place. And that story is part of his founding story, that he formed Charity Water, which is now one of the most powerful nonprofits. Understanding that story makes me, as a donor, perhaps want to give him money to help not only these children who are drinking unclean water, but about himself. So this idea of story is very integral. Let's move on. Purpose. Purpose is so important, and sometimes we get a tendency to overuse words, but I think that, like in this image, one looks at the business and one looks at the transaction and the ROI and all the attributes of a product. A purpose is really important because not only does it bring forward what you do and what you care about, it shapes the way you look at the world. And in that way, if you're a leader of a company, it also helps internal branding. In other words, bringing forward the right talent and the people who want to be a part of something bigger than who they are. And this idea of purpose is so critical in a world that is very cluttered. And you have to say, this is what we stand for in terms of what we do, but why we do it is our purpose. Okay? Citizenship. Here is an example of, motorcycles or Harley Davidson. And obviously, it's a great motorcycle. It may not be the best, but this idea of citizenship, I want to be free on the weekends. I want to, ride with my friends. I want to take on the world and feel this sense that I am connected. And this idea of citizenship is the driver. If you can get to that place of citizenship, that you feel one with the brand, then you've really transcended the brand itself. Onward. And, all of those attributes are key. But at the end of the day, brands are about decision-making, whether it's heart and mind, how we make decisions, how we look at that decision really transacts into bottom line. I mean, If you look at Coca-Cola and you look at the functionality of the products or the bottling plant, and you look at the brand of why you want to be happy and refreshed, the bottom line shows, and you can see that in dollars and cents if you wanted to go to Interbrand, which is a very well-known brand agency. They list the top, in billions of dollars from Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and others, what the brand decision-making is that leads people to say, I want to belong to this and I want to buy it, and therefore it is the bottom line. It is an economic intangible on the balance sheet. Okay, branding. Next. So just to reiterate, it stands out, it communicates, it has value, it has emotion, it galvanizes internal culture as well as external. And this is really critical. It attracts people who want to be a part of your organization. It sets guidelines for many of the partners you may have, and there are many partners, so there's consistency. And ultimately, which is what we're going to talk next about, which is this idea of differentiation. And what does it mean to zig versus zag, and what that is. So let's look at that. This is really why I think we're here. Okay, going back to 1959, Doyle Dane Bernbach was one of the leading agencies. And if you were around or if you've read your history, the turn to the 1960s was a period of the growth of suburbia and the growth of automobiles. And they were flashy, they were big, they were American, they were muscle cars. And all of a sudden, Volkswagen, which was a German company, decided to enter into the American market. And this idea of finding the white space, if you look at the marriage between that statement and this ad, which was done in 1959, this idea was to find where others are not. So obviously in the world of automotive, this American muscle car, flash, speed, luxury, really distinguished this idea of think small. And if you think small, you see this Volkswagen. It was sort of an ugly, kind of strange looking car. But if you look at this ad, which has resonated and really defined in many ways one of the greatest ads and the greatest campaigns to creating the icon for Volkswagen, which also transacted into really building out 1959, 120,000 cars at a price, by the way, of $1,565, which is pretty good. But nonetheless, it really created this idea of a white space, of go where others are not. And advertisers, marketers have tried and want to differentiate, to find that place where others are not. So let's go to the next slide and see how that may have transacted even further. This is established in something like REI. So we all know Black Friday. It's where you go and shop. And in 2015 and to today, it took a hiatus in 1 year. This idea of opting outside, of going outside. Why? REI is a company, as you well know, that spends its time and money in getting people to go outdoors by buying some of the products they sell, whether they're shirts or canoes or kayaks or shoes. And this idea was close down Friday, no more consumerism. Let's stop it and go out. They closed every door. They turned it off. They had their employees go out and absolutely enjoy the outdoors. And by doing this, they got billions and literally billions of media impressions over the period of 2015 to today. They've defined their brand around it. And in some ways, they've also built partnerships where they say, yes, Black Friday is a place to buy, but go outside and see what it's like. And this idea of looking at the white space, of not saying, go buy, here's what's on sale. Let us transcend that and go out and opt outside. Very powerful campaign, has truly defined them. Their brand story is now very much a part of going outside. I wanted to give homage to Marty Neumeier. He's a person who I've admired. He wrote the book Zag, which is our Zig, and Brand Gap, which is what we're talking about today, building creative and technology and innovation and strategy together. Today's real competition doesn't come from other companies, but from the extreme clutter of the marketplace. This idea of finding this differentiation, of looking at it, of building together a creative and strategic point of view, and then moving across the clutter so you find something new. Okay, onward. So let's get to process now. And here's some slides on process. Whether it's rebranding or refreshing, and these things are important. Rebrand is very big, it takes on a lot. Refreshes, how do we spark? How do we get back to some of the focus? But some questions that you need to ask yourself are the following. What are the emotional triggers? What really defines who your audience is? And not only just in terms of demographic profiles, but what drives them? What is their connecting points? What is it that they want to and need? How do they want to belong? Really understand them, spend time, talk to them, understand who they are. If there are more than one audiences, make sure you build, and we'll see what that is, personas of who they are, but really know your audience. Number two. Context. Context is absolutely critical. How do you understand the context of something, the trends, the environment? If you're looking at Patagonia, for instance, what is the world of sustainability? If you're looking at millennials and younger people or Gen Z, what's going on in terms of how they play? What is their usage in terms of social media? How do they spend their time? Understanding context without brand is an absolute must-have. It's lock and key. Next. Organization. At the end of the day, it has to be fulfilled. What can you do? You can't just promise something. It is a promise and it's built on trust. If you can't prove it and you don't have it within the domain, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And we've seen that over and over again in so many brands that we can talk about where they haven't fulfilled and they have gotten to crisis. And therefore, you must be able to say, this is proven, we can do it. Next. Activation. What are the short and long-term priorities? And there's what can you do immediately so that you can benchmark, and what will happen over the long term. And we'll see that in brand marketing once we get to it. It is a long-term commitment. It is not performance-based and direct. It takes the time and energy to do this. From an organizational standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, it doesn't happen overnight. And this is really important. And make sure that your priorities, your budgets, and resources are in play. Next. So looking at brand strategy, what is the strategy? How does it work with the business? We have such important values now when it comes to data and insights. So make sure that the research is being done, whether it be predictive, analytic, key to have that intelligence, understand your audience, and know if you're going to rebrand or refresh, if you're going to create that evolution or that revolution, which way to go and how far you can do it and how you can get buy-in at what point in time. Is it a merger and acquisition? Is it new products? Is it new audiences? Understand that from the strategy intelligent audiences, and therefore you can decide if you're going to rebrand or refresh. Onward. This is a dense slide, and I'm not going to go through bullet by bullet, but I just think it's important that we all understand what it takes to do this. At REQ, we look at it in 4 phases, starting from strategy to identity. And we have the discovery process. We look at stakeholders. We look at quantitative and qualitative, understanding the competitors. We ideate together. We work together hand in key, lock and key, and hand in hand with the client to understand who they are. And we build out audience personas, and I'll show you one in a moment. That's discovery. Brand strategy is here's what it is. Here's how you're perceived. Here's your platform, your pillars, your values, your story, your positioning. This is if you have a new name, your tagline, and your messaging. This is how you stand. This is why you belong. This is your emotional core of what your story is, and we tell the story. And it defines who you are as in terms of your brand strategy. It is kind of the deliverable. Once we know that, that really helps cascade into the physical side, which is where Kenny is going to talk about. What does it look like? What is this swoosh? What is this color palette? What is this idea of messaging? What does the collateral look like? What is the content? What is the way in which this brand lives? And how do you design it in such a way across all channels that it is viable and it resonates to audiences and to new partners and more? And last is activation. This is really important. We can do all of that, but if you don't have budget and it's not just a question of big budget, but making sure that you understand that is pay, so paid, earn, shared, and own, that you do search, that you do internal communication, so there's a buy-in from the board on down and to the individuals who are part of the organization, and create content and execution so that it lives in such a way that is creative across all media, and then you review and evolve. This idea is very, a large slide, but these are the steps along the way. Okay. Here's one example of a persona, and I think it's really important to sort of represent just one deliverable. Here's Jessica. She works in SaaS. We want to know who she is and what she does. And if you can see, we have everything from she has an iPhone in her bag and she has subscriptions to Spotify. She spends time, at podcasts. She basically is somebody. This is for someone who is a retailer who is looking for, how she enjoys herself, wants a good vibe. And this is an aggregate. This is not a real person, Jessica C. She's an aggregate of many of the traits of your audiences. And it is critical that you build this, because sometimes we have the tendency, as we look at brand strategy, to think only of ourselves and the leaders and who is in the organization. We always cascade between, okay, so this is what you think, but what does Jessica think? And this is Jessica. So we make sure there's accountability to understanding who our audience is, and therefore we give Jessica a point of view in terms of a persona. Okay. Brooke, who runs media, and we have a very active media department, will look very deeply at the media buying. But I wanted to give a shout out for this when it comes to marketing the brand. And I think it's important to create content and creative that's emotional and story driven as well as rational. In some ways, those are really important. It's not just how much it costs or when we're doing this, but what and who is involved and why that emotion is important. If it's a child or a Jessica, what is it that's going to make her feel, social currency and excited about going to this place she wants to go? So mix that emotion. Be a storyteller. Use video if you can. You can do it in so many ways, and stories are being beautifully told through video, as we all know. Use short and long-term thinking, and use digital media and traditional. This idea of 50-50 is a very interesting point of view. It's been looked at and analyzed by people who are much more involved in brand analytics and marketing, but they've seen that brand, the long term, is really important, that 50% of your budget is there marked for brand because it takes a long time versus performance being critical in terms of direct. We want to sell this, we want to do this, but 50-50 is over the long term, is something to think about. And then review and evolve. Okay. One other last word, because I thought it would come up, brand and AI. If you notice green, yellow, red, it's not so much today, what are we going to do about AI? It's how are we going to use it and what is part of our lives? And in terms of marketing, it has pluses and minuses. Clearly, data analytics can give you really great audience insights. And whether they be predictive or analytic, getting deep into AI with the tools that they have is really fantastic. In terms of driving impact, it saves money and time, it saves resources, it allocates in many ways, so that impact can be, really measurable when you're starting to look at what ROI is and how much you're going to do in terms of your brand. And that's really wonderful. Message clarity, it's tricky because it's a yellow, because it's certainly good for experimentation and brainstorming. You can put your messaging into Gen AI and you can see, language and grammar, but you also have to be careful because of the reds. Does it have authenticity and does it have disinformation? Obviously, these are critical things. We've seen it and heard about it over and over again. And in the most recent Dove campaign, which you might look at, their brand is about real beauty and about the beauty of women. And they said their campaign is, we will never, ever use AI imagery to show women. And so that point of view of being authentic is definitely a challenge of AI. Okay. So some takeaways before I pass it over to Kenny. Brands reside in the mind, so keep them simple. Keep them simple. And I think that's really critical. Recognize emotion as a driving force. Make them authentic and tell your story. Strike that balance between a long-term and short-term activation. Give it room to grow. And at the end of the day, zig, find that white space and make your brand stand out. And I love this little this cartoon. So I pass it over to Kenny. Thank you so much. And we'll hopefully get back for questions.
Cool. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you all for joining. My name is Kenny Rufino. As Avelyn mentioned, I'm an EVP and the creative director at REQ. I wanted to start a little bit with just sort of a quick mini agenda of what I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about sort of a brand identity, start with the building blocks and the different sort of components that are part of it. But I really wanted to kind of also mention reasons why the identity is important, why the creative aspect and how that brings the strategy to life is really, really important, just as important as the strategy. I have friends who I consider do important things for a living. You know, they're doctors, they work with children, they work with, you know, battered wives, for example. And as much as I love them and as close as I am to them, what I do and what my team does, sometimes it's full transparency, it can be dismissed as, you know, maybe something superficial. It might be dismissed as window dressing. It's just a look and feel, et cetera. And people are entitled to their opinions, right? So leave it at there. I think if there's anything that I hope that you take away from my section, it's that understanding why the identity is important and how it can actually have an impact on your organization's bottom line. So in summary, a brand identity, if we can go to the next slide, it's really a strategic tool. It communicates the brand's values, the personality, the brand promise to their target audiences. And it's a collection of things like visual, verbal, multisensory sort of elements that represents a brand and importantly distinguishes it from others in the market. Now, that's a really sort of boring textbook definition. And I hate that I opened with that, but it's true, it's factual, that is what it is. But you want to kind of think of it as everybody who's here and everybody who's watching this recording, you can kind of think of yourselves as your own sort of brand. You have your own beliefs, you know what you stand for. So you, on top of that, you can think of like the clothes that you choose to wear and the car that you drive, how you decorate your home and how you speak and how you act and how you react. Those are all going to be expressions and manifestations of your own values and your own personality. So let's move on to the next slide. There's several sort of components I wanted to highlight. You're likely all very familiar with these. You needed a logo, right? A lot of people confuse the logo as the only part or the most important part of an identity. It is an important part. I wouldn't necessarily say it's sort of above and beyond everything else. It really is this sort of kit of parts, this system that really sort of connects and really communicates everything. Logos are sometimes symbols, sometimes they're just typography, sometimes they're a combination of two. Really effective ones are memorable and they're simple, like what Stephen said. They're brought to life through color. And color is super important. And a lot of designers don't really sort of think much about color, sometimes opting for colors that might be sort of, you know, very trendy at the moment. Or maybe it's a color that they personally feel enamored with. But there's so much to color theory and color psychology, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of colors, and they all can kind of mean different things. But from the beginning, you know, from birth, you know, we're taught sort of associations with color. You know, a certain kind of red might mean stop, and we think of greens as being something that represents nature, maybe represents growth. Even blues, the kinds of blues, a deep sort of conservative blue is very, very different from a brighter, hopeful and optimistic blue, for example. So color is a very sort of important ingredient in an identity. Typography is also very important. People probably focus a little bit more on color than on typography, but just changing typography, even in a subtle way, really communicates something very, very differently. And I know I have this sort of screenshot of like a New York written out in different ways. But I remember talking to the team about this one time, some of my colleagues, where if you wrote out the story of the Three Little Pigs and you changed the font from something standard, maybe it's a very classical, you know, serif, it reads like an old school story. You change it to a modern sort of sans serif, it kind of brings it into this century, at least, hopefully. But if you change it into something whimsical or quirky, something that you might associate with like a horror movie, it amplifies the violence in the story and actually renders it inappropriate for children. So again, different target audience. So typography, absolutely essential. The imagery style as well. You know, if you are trying to convey optimism and hope and happiness, but your imagery style is very moody and dark and heavy on the shadows, that conflict is going to raise red flags in your audiences, even if they're not photographers, even if they're not in any sort of creative capacity. Again, we're taught all these associations from birth, and having the right imagery sort of complement everything else around it really provides a sort of surround sound effect, and hopefully will make your identity more effective. On the next slide, a few more sort of components, typical components of an identity. You've got visual elements. Think iconography, think patterns, etc. These are the things that really sort of build out the visual system. Your physical presence. What does your office look like? What does your presence at a trade show look like? All of that needs to sort of communicate who you are. And you can think of Apple, and when they launched the Apple Store, it was pretty revolutionary to think of a store like that. That sold computers, that sold sort of technology products, when we were really used to things like Best Buy and Circuit City, rest in peace, Circuit City, maybe CompUSA. Probably dating myself a little bit here. Let's move on to the next. So digital presence, you need website, you know, your website, your social media. If we can go back one, thanks. All of that also needs to communicate. And there are things that are very specific to digital, you know, motion and things like that, that really, again, need to sort of communicate the elements of your brand. Finally, emerging media, we're at a turning point right now. Obviously, you've heard about things like virtual reality, augmented reality, buzzword reality, et cetera. Apple tried launching, you know, their new mixed reality headset. Things are going to accelerate if Apple gets it right. They're usually a very key driver in terms of how the general population embraces certain kinds of technology. So if they get it right, how people interact with your brand through some sort of new sort of media is also probably going to be critical in terms of what you need to be thinking about and implementing strategically. All right, let's keep going. A few slides here on why the identity is important. So the first thing is that the brand identity sets the impression. And it's likely the first experience that an audience is going to have with a brand, whether that's hearing the name in passing, or seeing the logo, or even visiting the website, or using an app. The identity really helps a brand create a positive first impression, but hopefully a lasting positive impression on its target audience. On the next slide is an example of one I think does it very, very well, and that's Netflix. We're all familiar with Netflix. I mean, Netflix and chill, they became like a thing, right? And it's so hard for brands to kind of break through and even just be successful, but to be adopted and embraced and a part of popular culture is really quite a testament to sort of their branding work. When they launched, if any of you might not have realized or maybe have forgotten, they launched as a DVD by mail service. And they had these iconic red envelopes, varying quality. We won't get into that. But at that time when they launched, Blockbuster was the king of rental video. And the Blockbuster boxes, I didn't even include it here because they're so boring. They're so depressing. Very sort of uninteresting white, big Blockbuster logo. Sure, it's recognizable, but entertainment's supposed to be entertaining. It's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to be thrilling. It's supposed to tap into an emotion. And the Blockbuster boxes were the opposite of that. And so here comes Netflix with this fiery red envelope, instantly became iconic. And as they grew and moved away from rentals by mail, and they moved purely into the sort of digital space, they were smart and they really sort of thought about the design of their web experience and their app experience. How can you make endless entertainment very easy and simple? Netflix believes that simplicity is the core of their user experience, and they're always constantly tweaking things along with their algorithm to make sure that people are able to watch content that's relevant to them really easily. They were also really a pioneer in sort of audio design. I'm not going to do the sound, but you will all know the ta-dum sound that plays, that little 3-second sort of snippet when you launch the Netflix app. That's become synonymous, and it really sort of reinforces the impression of Netflix. All right, the next slide is about recognition. So the brand identity fosters recognition. And our days, we're all busy. Our attention spans are getting shorter regardless of your age. But when we want something or when we need something, our brains need to sort through all of this noise. to really sort of identify, well, what's going to fulfill that need, right? And if we were to thinking of how the identity can help, on the next slide, just very sort of iconic examples, you can think of when you're hungry, and seeing the golden arches might sort of spark things within you, might give you certain sort of emotion, some sort of feeling, some sort of craving, right? You're thirsty. What does the Coke bottle, the shape of the Coke bottle look like? Even just the glistening of the condensation on the bottle, it spurs emotions within a viewer. You know, we're not even mentioning the iconic red label of Coke. And certainly IBM, you know, a lot of this so far has been on sort of the direct-to-consumer B2C, but there's so many pioneers and sort of like Paul Rand, who worked with IBM. Even today, agencies and designers who are working for brands like MailChimp in the B2B space, even some of the work that we've done in the B2G space, really sort of thinks through how can you get through the clutter and really sort of get people to recognize your brand out in the market. All right, the next slide really quickly here is about trust and credibility. And my point here is that a lot of this has done through consistency. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the creative needs to be the same everywhere, because you can have distinct experiences. You can think of how Apple's iPhone experience isn't necessarily the same thing as being in an Apple store, but the overall feeling of Apple, the brand, is communicated in different ways depending on the media or how you're trying to do it. So just like a parent really teaches a child things by being consistent and reliable and authentic, what the identity does is it really deepens that emotional connection that Stephen was talking about between audiences and your brand. All right, the next slide is about, oh, I lied, I'm sorry. Some quick examples here about trust and credibility. Band-Aid, UPS, Lysol, Kleenex, I can go on and on and on. They're some of the most trusted brands, and they've been some of the most trusted brands for years. And when it comes to the identity, and it comes to sort of the designers who are part of this, they know that you can't mess with a good thing. You can make it feel relevant and modern and contemporary, so that as audiences, their tastes and their preferences evolve throughout time, the things that they're exposed to might sort of change their preferences. You're remaining sort of constant and recognizable through consistency. All right, next slide is about perception. And this is last but not least, it's very important. The brand identity helps shape perception in the marketplace. It's what sets the brand apart. To the next slide, you can think of American Express and how it's really differently perceived from a city, or especially from like a Capital One. Each of them has very similar product offerings, right? They'll have a premium card, maybe a cashback card, and checking accounts and so forth. But what American Express has done from a creative standpoint that's actually very admirable is that they use design and messaging and bring it all together through their experiences, whether it's in their advertising or in their product design or even in their interiors, that really separate them from the pack. You know, this isn't just a financial product, this is a membership. They pioneered the thought of sort of high-end lounges in airports. They were also, like Apple, heavily responsible for transforming a product into an experience. Unboxing a premium card became an experience and a YouTube staple. Whether that's good or bad for society, it's popular. On to the next slide, just to quickly close with just a really quick case study. The logos that you see here, I'm sure some of you are familiar with a lot of them actually. These are mattress retailers, and the identities for mattress retailers, you can kind of see there's a hodgepodge of styles. It's like going to some sort of magical, buffet restaurant, and there's a Japanese food section, and then there's like a Western section, and there's like a dessert bar. They don't really sort of blend together, but they're all in the same space for some reason or another. Some of these logos look like they were designed decades ago, and it's true. I think Sleepy's was originally designed in the 30s or the 40s. Don't quote me there. Mattress Firm feels like the 80s, which may not necessarily a bad thing, but again, we're a few decades away from the 80s. It's important, I think, that these brands should have realized that they need to keep up with how audiences have evolved. So on to the next slide, here comes a company called Casper. And first and foremost, let's talk about the name. All of the companies that were listed on the previous slide had the word mattress in their name, at least most of them did. And here comes something that doesn't even have the word mattress in the name. The logo itself has no cartoon or illustration representation of a mattress or somebody sleeping. It's just this sort of modified sans serif here. And this was, I think, in 2013 or 2014, so a good 10 years ago. And what Casper did was they really put a spotlight on how terrible mattress buying is. If you've ever been into a mattress showroom, it's the worst place to be. I mean, there are a lot of other worse places, but it's just naked mattresses. It feels very bland and clinical, and God knows how many people touch that mattress or lay down on that mattress before you. It's just horrible. The lighting's just everything. And they're big and heavy, and how do you get them home? And it's hard to tell the difference between them. So what Casper did on the next slide is they thought about the identity and across all the different touch points that Casper was going to be a part of. And they did it so brilliantly. The packaging, the unboxing experience, this mattress came rolled up. So it was easy for somebody to assemble on their own. Their retail spaces they launched were fun and unique and quirky. They felt like a new sort of experience. You know, they offered people to take naps in rooms that were sanitized and clean so that you could actually try the product. They used illustration styles, bright colors to make things feel alive. They used language in their naming, calling a cooling mattress a snow mattress, or maybe something that had a little bit of a different feeling, you know, a wave hybrid mattress. Casper did that so well. And I think relating to perception is that they didn't call themselves a mattress company. They came out of the gate and they said that they were a sleep company. And so I think, you know, that was able to kind of really sort of propel them to the front of the pack back then. And then here, just some quick screenshots, very early Instagram, celebrities and influencers from back in the day, posing and taking selfies with the box, not even the mattress, but the box that the rolled up mattress came in that you will likely discard. And these were super popular back in the day. So again, kudos to Casper. A couple more slides, and I'm going to close it out. There's a ton of research really in just the recent times. I'd say it's been less than 10 years. We've had research from Forrester and IBM, you know, the UK Design Council and so forth on how design is really contributing, creativity is really contributing to the success of businesses. Regardless of space. So obviously Casper was a direct-to-consumer company, but all of these reports and all of this research is targeting different areas. And the UK Council here, for example, is targeting businesses in the UK. There are reports that target specific B2B success, where people are thinking about creative really more strategically and implementing it more thoughtfully. The next slide here really is a quote that I like. It's from another report that McKinsey did called The Business Value of Design. And it's that companies that excel at design, they grow revenues and shareholder returns at nearly twice the rate of their industry peers. It can be massively powerful if you utilize it the right way. And this isn't even a recent phenomenon. I mentioned IBM earlier, and the thinking that Paul Rand built out through the IBM team about having something recognizable and sort of applying a system of creativity across all of the different IBM touch points really sort of propelled them to success since his work with them. I wanted to sort of close here with one quick quote that hopefully sort of sums up everything. Susan Sellers, I'm sorry, if you could go back. Susan Sellers is a pioneer in the sort of the design industry. She's a founder, I think, managing partner of a New York-based agency that I follow. And she has this really succinct quote where she says that brand is the story and design is the storytelling. Now, I think there's more to it than design, right? There's certainly the messaging and all of it, but really that sums it up perfectly for me. And so to close it down here and maybe to lower down my excitement a little bit, if we can move on to the next slide, we really just wanted to sort of encourage all of you to really sort of think through what are the possibilities that are available to you and your organizations. Can you create opportunities for yourselves, regardless of what space you're in? You know, B2B, B2G, lots of B2Bs, and really sort of be able to differentiate yourselves. You know, how can you sort of tell a different story and have a sort of unique and recognizable identity that supports and communicates that? And that's why we pose the question, if you know you're ready to zig. So I'll pass it over to the rest of our team if there's any other comments from them. But if not, we'd love to sort of hear any sort of comments or questions that any of you might have.
Steve and Kenny, thank you both so much. I'm going to go ahead and pull the deck down, and I'll be monitoring the chat. But I also welcome anybody who would like to, if you're willing to come off mute or on camera, we'd love to hear your questions.
I have a quick question. I think we see so many creative activations in brand and design in the B2C space. What would you encourage B2B companies to take from those experiences and apply as a best practice to their own design and brand initiatives?
I'll start and I'll make it short, and Kenny, you can add. We get that question a lot because we, as you know, we have lots of B2B clients. And I think that at the end of the day, whether it's B2B or B2C, you still have to tell the story. There's an emotion. And why is that? Because even though you're selling to B2B, you're still dealing with people. You're still dealing with human beings who make decisions, whether it's about, you know, that purpose and that value and why I care. So I think there's a blur between B2B and B2C. Certainly the category is different. But if you think about Intel Inside, you think about Salesforce, Adobe, IBM, there's still emotionality. They're still telling stories. You see how Adobe, in terms of, you know, they're spending a lot of money on advertising, you know, how this can transform a world for young kids to be able to, you know, create their own experiences. Well, you know, B2B and B2C, I think even though they're defined differently, it's the human that is the center. So I think there's a lot of blur in that. Can you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, from our experience, what we're starting to see, especially something that's accelerating within the past few years, is that the silos are kind of not necessarily totally coming down, but things are bleeding together. They're blending together. We're starting to see, when Stephen's talking about find the white space, there's so much opportunity and white space in B2B and B2G. And you're starting to see companies sort of embrace things that might have been in the past, even just recently, considered maybe too creative or too quirky or too colorful, and that would be appropriate for, you know, something that's maybe direct to consumer. And you're starting to see a lot of experimentation. You know, you can. I mentioned MailChimp earlier. MailChimp is fun. Like I mean, they're fun for what they do. You know, they employ a lot of creative tactics that in the past have really just employed by B2C companies. So lots of, I think, potential there. But really look outside your space is sort of the recommendation.
Thank you.
Good question. I'm running a startup, a fintech startup, and you guys went over some incredibly iconic brands, right? Which are easy to, right, household names. So any one or two tidbit takeaways for folks that are trying to build a brand that don't quite have sort of a full team and all, you know, what, you know, where would you pick your spots in building a brand in a startup?
Okay, so I'll take this. First of all, thank you for the question. Absolutely key. You know, sometimes we have a tendency to talk about these iconic brands, but when it comes down to it, we have worked with startups, and what is really important is a couple of things. Make sure there's reality that you're really committed to the brand, particularly if you're a leading organization in that space. There's something called category. So hopefully, if it's proudly, you know, make sure that you own that category in a way that even though you're not going to be the big gorilla, that you can do something unique to it. That's really important. Number two, when it comes to the brand itself, even as a startup, and particularly as a startup, you're talking about getting the right people in your organization as well as sales. So use it as a way to galvanize and to build internal communications through hopefully getting those who are looking at fintech space, which is a huge space, that this is the place you need to go. You can go to a lot of companies, but you go to your place. And so make sure that you have a focus on your brand that ultimately tells a story that can both attract those people to it internally, so you get the right team, as well as externally. And then that's what I would say. So yes, it can start, but even as a startup, so many of the companies, we all know the garage story of Steve Jobs and Wozniak. Obviously Apple's done quite well in the trillions of dollars. Fintech is an enormous category as well as you know, and it does take startups, and it really does work both internally and externally. So I'll pause there. Anything, Kenny, you want to add?
Yeah, something anecdotal, but thank you, for the question, Glenn. A friend of mine was part of Betterment when they were a startup. And we would trade stories. At that point, I was about to leave a startup that I was with for about 10 years. And so we were sort of trading stories, and they were getting a lot of attention. And she told me about how things felt very sort of fragmented internally. People weren't really quite sure to describe, what they did, or why it was important, or even understand the product, things like this. And that sort of trickled outward into the work that they did, whether they were part of a design or a product design team, or whether they were in some sort of a marketing or communications role. And what they did, and pretty smartly, I think in the beginning at least, was to really they paused as much as a startup can pause. And they really brought everybody onto the same page, so that then they could then sort of move forward all together, if that makes sense.
Totally.
I think we have time for maybe 1 to 2 more questions. Marta, I see you popping on. Oh, it seems that you're on mute though. Maybe a speaker side of the house. If you'd like to type it into the chat, we can definitely jump into it. And while you do that, I'd love to add to Kenny and Stephen, Lily, your question as well as yours, Glenn. We often come at brand. Stephen shared the audience persona. When we do audience personas for our clients, we often have multiple audiences. You may have your buyer, you may have your employee, ideal employee prospect. You might also have your media as well as investor type of profiles, and keeping all of those, but being able to make sure that you do have that consistent message, so that no matter how you're talking about the company internally, as it matches what is being said externally. We often have folks come to us and we have them go through a practice that we call destination mapping. So really leveraging what is the end goal of short-term as well as long-term. And we find that those destinations come out to 4. The first one might be M&A, whether you're on the buy side or the sell side. Might also be looking for fundraising, perhaps in your case, Glenn. The second is looking at revenue, so lead generation or actual e-com or actual sales. The third is recruiting, so talent or advocates. And the fourth is thought leadership, building in more of a content to really own a specific space. And I think that is an area where you can really find your white space and stick to it. But thinking about your audiences and how you might be prioritizing them on a quarterly basis or a long-term basis. Marta, how are we doing over there? Any luck? Okay. We'll follow up with you afterwards. All right. Well, if there are no other questions for today, thank you all so much for, we do have one more. Oh, excuse me, we have 2 popping in. So Connie, we've heard from B2B and startup, one more niche for you if possible. We are a parent company. How would you treat brand recognition when your ultimate goal is to bring awareness to the brands underneath your brand? Are there emotions or tactics to leverage over others? That is a very great question. So an umbrella brand that wants to bring focus. Stephen.
So we only have a minute or 2, and I'd love to follow up after this. It's called brand architecture. And that's really an important consideration. Whether you look at co-brands, sub-brands, umbrella brands, I think there's many ways to approach it. One way to approach a brand architect is to look at the organization itself. How directive are you? Are you going to be able to have the brands or the sub-brands live by themselves, sort of like a Procter and Gamble that has multiple brands of different brands themselves? Or are you directive like someone like Apple, that everything is tied to, iPhone, iPod, et cetera. So the question is, it's about architecture, and architecture fits so that there's either consistency or a family of brands or a house of brands, or you can purposely have those brands live independent. And that's a 1-minute description of what your question is, but let's follow up on that. It's a very important one.
And then I'll finish with Caitlin's question. This goes very much to the creative side of the house. Kenny, how does your team validate creative work from an expense perspective? As a creative team, we've been working to find ways to make our creative work more quantifiable. Naturally, it's a challenge because creative work isn't an exact science. So what advice do you have for Caitlin?
Tell them they don't know what they're talking about. No. I hear what you're saying, Caitlin. I've heard it a lot of times. I've heard it from colleagues who I consider very close friends and colleagues, but even from clients. They'll wonder about that because so much of what we do is subjective. Luckily, we're at a point in time right now where there are tools that allow us to quantify or at least add something measurable to the creative output that your team has, right? You can do testing. That's probably one of the easiest ways to kind of show value and sort of what's working. If you're running campaigns, media campaigns, depending on where you're running them, there's lots of ways to kind of show what kind of creative direction or concept might be performing better than others. And I think you really see to also balance that because you don't, I would encourage you and your team, hopefully, to not go too heavily down the road of relying on testing. Because at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that creativity is a human endeavor. And a lot of it comes from experience and the intuition that you have and that you will develop as a creative professional through your experiences, whether they're your professional experiences or even the personal experiences that you and your team will have. So there has to be a balance of both. And when you run into somebody who doesn't quite understand something that you're putting forward, but you feel strongly in your intuition, in your gut about why it's the right way to go, you need to be able to master how to communicate the potential value of it and maybe compare and contrast it to something that they might be sort of more accepting, but you feel very strongly will perform less, if that's helpful. Happy to connect with you separately because that's, again, a big discussion, but I appreciate the question.
Totally. Avelyn?
Tremendous. Right on the hour. I thank you to everybody who attended. Thank you so much, Kenny and Stephen, for your insights today, and Elizabeth for all of the work that you've put into making sure people know about us. So as a follow-up, we'll send the recording of today's presentation, but thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.